In this video, we're going to be testing the final thing we need to test before we test components. That is the expenses reducer. So the expenses reducer allows us to add expenses, remove expenses, and edit expenses. We're going to write test cases that make sure it works as expected. Now, we do already have the reducers folder in the tests directory right here. So we can just create a new file inside expenses.test.js, and this is where our test cases are going to live. So let's go ahead and kick things off by importing the reducer. I'm going to import expenses reducer from, I need to go up 2 directories. I need to go into the reducers folder. In there, I have expenses. Awesome. So we have this import in place, and now we can start adding our test cases. And the first one that we're going to add together will just be one that makes sure the default state gets set equal to an empty array. So right here, we can add a test case. I'm going to give this one a name. Should set default state. I'm going to set up that arrow function, and then all we're going to do is dispatch that init action once again. So I can go ahead and create a const for state, set it equal to whatever comes back from calling expenses reducer, and I can call expenses reducer with an undefined state value, since the point is to test the default and the action object for init. A type value equal to inside of quotes at uppercase init. Perfect. Now all we have to do is toss a semicolon on the end and make our assertion. We're expecting it to equal an empty array, and that's an easy one. Expect state to equal an empty array. Awesome. So if we go ahead and save the expenses test file, we're going to see we now have 22 passing test cases. The entire suite is passing, not a single failing test in sight. Now for this one, we didn't need to pass any data into the first argument. We actually wanted to pass in undefined. But for the other ones, especially remove expense and edit expense, we're going to need test data we can work with. We're going to need data that we can pass in as that first argument, and then we're going to make sure things changed. And that is very similar to what we did in the selectors expense test file. In here, we had a set of data. This was the baseline test data that all of our test cases could work off of. We were able to pass it in to select expenses and make assertions about what came back. And we're going to be doing the exact same thing for the reducer. Now, we could go ahead and just take this data and copy it over there, but it would be better to create a separate file where this array lives and then just have both files import the array so they can both use them. Now we're going to create a new directory to store this array in the tests folder, a new folder, and I'm going to call this one fixtures, Fixtures. In the test world, a fixture is just your baseline test data. So you could think of it as dummy data, test data, a fixture. They really all mean the same thing. And in the fixtures folder, we're just going to create one for our expenses. So we can create one, expenses.js. Now we can actually define the fixture, which is just going to be the array right here. So I'm going to go ahead and take the entire array and cut it out of this file. Now I'm not going to save the file because that would cause things to fail. I'm going to paste the array in here, and then we just need to change a few things. First up, we're using moment. We should probably import it. Import moment from moment. And the second thing that we're going to do after I change form to from is to export something. And I'm just going to export this array by default. Export default the array. So now that we have the fixture file set up, we can just import this anywhere we want to use this test data. So for example, right here in this file, I can import it, importing expenses from, we have to go up a single directory, then into the fixtures folder, and in there we have our expenses fixture. Now I can take this exact same line and copy it over to the other file. First up, I will save this one. Hopefully all of the test cases are still passing. They still are passing. Now we can import it up above in the expenses reducer test case file. So now that we have this seed data in place, we can start moving on to the more meaningful test cases, making sure they're actually manipulating that array as expected. Now we're going to go through the process of creating 5 test cases, then we'll be done. We're going to create 2 together, and you're going to create 3 on your own. We're going to be testing remove expense together, and we're going to create 2 because we want to go through one where we enter a valid ID and make sure it is removed. Then we're going to go through another where we try to remove an expense by an ID that doesn't exist, and we're going to make sure that the ones that are in there don't get removed. So we're going to add 2 right now for that. First up, we're going to call test. For the first one, we can use a name of should remove expense by ID. Then we can set up our function, and here we can actually go ahead and call the expenses reducer. Now I am going to set up the action first, and I'll create a separate variable for that. So a const action, we need the type and we need the ID, the two things that we are expecting. So the type for this one would be remove expense. And the ID of the expense we're trying to remove is going to be one of the real ones. So we can look into the expenses test data. So for example, I could remove this guy right here with the ID of 2. I'm going to go ahead and do just that by accessing it. Expenses. I'm going to grab the second one and I'm going to grab the ID property. Now that we have the action object all set up, we can actually dispatch it. And by dispatch it, I mean just call expenses reducer. So const state is going to be the return value. Expenses reducer needs to get called. We're going to call it with those two things. We have the test data, the expenses array. We have the action object right here. And now we should have the new array coming back with just 2 items. Remember, the middle one should have been removed. So we should just see the first one and the third one. I'm going to go ahead and make an assertion for that, expecting state to equal an array. And in here, we're going to use the same technique we used when we were testing the selector. I'm just going to access the first one, expenses. And then I'm going to access the third one as the second item in this array. So expenses with the index of 2. Now this is basically saying, hey, we should have the shortened version of the array coming back where the middle one has been removed. And if we go ahead and save the expenses test file, we can see the test case is passing, which means that we are good to go. Now the next test case we're going to write is going to be basically the opposite of this one. So I'm going to go ahead and take this test case and just duplicate it. So in this case, we're going to say should not remove expenses if ID not found. So if the ID that we are dispatching isn't found, the expenses array should be unchanged. Right here, all we need to do is tweak this to something random. I'm going to go ahead and use -1 as my nil ID, something that does not exist in the fixtures data. Then all I need to do is change the assertion. We are expecting it to be an array that has been unchanged, so we can just reference the expenses array right here. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and save the expenses test suite, and we have another passing test. So that is it for what we're going to do together. There are 3 more test cases, and you're going to do them on your own. You're going to go ahead and do one test case for adding an expense, should add an expense. You're going to add 2 test cases for editing an expense. So should edit an expense. And then you're going to add one for when the ID of the expense you're trying to edit doesn't actually exist. Should not edit expense if expense not found. So these 2 test cases for editing the expense are going to be very similar to these 2 test cases. And for adding an expense, you're just going to assert that the array that comes back has another item with the values that you set up. So take some time to knock out these 3 test cases and test your work. Save the file and make sure they all show up and they're all passing. Take a moment to pause the video, and when you're done, click play. How'd that one go? We're going to go through the process together right now, starting with should add an expense. Test should add an expense. We're going to set up that arrow function. Then we're going to go through the process of filling out the test case. Now for this one, we do need to actually create some expense data for our new expense. So I will make that const expense. As I mentioned, there are multiple ways to get any of these test cases done. So as long as yours is working, that's great. Right here, what expenses are we going to add? We're just going to add this one object, so we will define it. I'm going to set an ID equal to something like 109. I will set a description equal to whatever I like. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and have it be for a new laptop. Then I will set a note value of undefined. We'll leave that as an empty string. We will use a created at value of whatever we like. I will stick to maybe 20,000. And finally, we need to know the amount. So for the amount, I'll say I bought a really terrible laptop. Let's go ahead and toss this one at $295. Perfect. So I have the expense data created. Next up, I need to create the action object. So const action. This is the action I'm trying to dispatch. And we need a couple of things. Most importantly, we do need the type. So right here, what is the type? The type for this one is add expense. And we have to attach the expense data. I can just attach it using the ES6 shorthand. Now what we need to do is actually pass all of this into the reducer. Const state equals whatever comes back from calling the expenses reducer. We're going to call it with a couple of things. First up, I am going to call it with the expenses fixture data. And then I'm going to pass in the action object that we just created. From here, all we have to do is make an assertion. I'm going to expect the array that comes back to equal, using to equal the following. Now I'm going to expect it to equal an array, and this is where you could have done all sorts of different things. Your assertion might look vastly different from mine. What I'm going to do though is spread out all of the items on the expenses array using the ES6 spread operator we explored earlier. Then I'm going to add on the one new item, the expense item we created up above. If the new array does have the 3 old ones followed by the new one, then we know that everything went well. If I go ahead and save the expenses test file, we do have another passing test case. So there we have it. We can now move on to editing an expense. We want to make sure that when we edit an expense with a valid ID, it does change. And when we edit an expense with an invalid ID, nothing changes. So right here, test should edit an expense. Then we can set up the arrow function. And we're going to go ahead and kick things off by defining the edits and the action object. For this one, I'm going to change the amount by creating a const amount. You might have changed something else. And I'm going to change the amount for, let's say, the second item. So I'll change the rent from $10.95 to something else, maybe $12.20. So right here, $12.20 with 2 zeros on the end. So my rent went up by a few bucks. Then I'm going to go ahead and define the action object. Const action, setting up that object. First up is the type. The type in this case would be edit expense. Then we can go ahead and set up the other values we need after type, one of them being ID. We need the valid ID, so we want to look into the fixture data, that is expenses. We want to grab that middle item that we said we were going to edit, that is the index of 1, and we're going to access its ID. And last is the updates object. So what are we trying to update? We put all of that right here. In our case, we're just trying to tweak the amount. So this is the action object. All we have to do is dispatch it and assert something about what comes back. Const state equals a call to expenses reducer, passing in all of the information. That is the expenses fixture data, our starting point, and our changes. Those changes are in the action object. And all we need to do is assert something about the data that came back. We want to assert that the second item now has a different amount value. So I'm going to expect state. I'm going to grab the second item with the index of 1. I'm going to grab its amount property, and I'm going to check its value using toBe. I'm expecting it to be what I had up above. I can just reference the exact same variable. Now, if I save things, we should have 26 passing test cases, and we do. Last up, should not edit an expense if expense not found. That one's really similar to this one. So I'm going to take this one. I'm going to paste it, and all we really need to do is mess up this ID. So I'm going to mess up the ID, changing it over to -1, and I'm also going to change the title. So should not edit an expense if ID not found. So we've changed the ID, which means that when we do actually dispatch the action, there should be no changes, and we can assert that by checking that the state that came back is exactly equal to what we passed in. If they are equal, we know nothing changed, in which case we want to consider that test a pass. If they did change, then we definitely have a problem because we shouldn't have any items with an ID of -1. Over here, you can see we actually are getting some sort of error. There is a difference between the two. That is because I used toBe as opposed to toEqual. So this is another great example of when you can just make these little mistakes. When you are working with the expect library, you might run into these all the time, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just going to switch this over to toEqual. Could have refilmed this pretending to be someone who never makes mistakes, but I do all the time, so I am going to leave that one in place. Now, if we change our code, we can see that everything is working as expected. We have 27 passing test cases. I'm going to remove the challenge comments, and there we go. We've tested every single part of our application except for the components. So we've tested our action generators, we've tested the reducers, we've tested the selectors. All that's left is the components. Now the components are going to be pretty tricky, so we are going to spend a good deal of this section on those, and we're going to get started with that process in the next video. So stay tuned. I'm very excited to get to that.